Hello and welcome to part 7 of the Etched brass soldering demo. Now, I had a bit of a nightmare when I recorded this and the microphone went wrong, had all kinds of buzzing all over it. So I'm going to add additional commentary on top of the video, so at times it may not quite fit. But what I'm doing here is removing with a scalpel blade and doing it very carefully to watch your fingers, just tiny amounts of solder that have come through as we've made those soldered joints between, in this case, the roof and the side, and then using the nail file from Boots, I think it was, or Superdrug, those kind of things. There it is, the nail file, a nice and thick one that's got a bit of sponginess to it, and getting that in there just to polish it all up. You don't want anything too nasty like the file or that kind of thing. The second cut file would probably make some marks in the brass at this stage. So we're just polishing, we're just making the final improvements. And then we're going to look at the ends. A little bit of solder's come over there, but we also want to try and disguise that link between the end and the side. And we'll do that by, again, just getting the file in there and trying to get some kind of rounded edge if we can. Not taking a lot of brass off, just taking a little bit and polishing it as well and getting a decent polished finish. Now, all of this is time that's really worth spending, because the minute you spray the primer on, all of these imperfections will really show up. At the moment, they're kind of hidden a little bit by the nature of the fact that the solder and the brass are different colours and that kind of thing. But the minute you put it all into a coat of primer, that will affect things. So it's well worth spending that time to get it just right, and obviously both ends as well. And then we can look at the chassis, and we've got the bogie pivot nuts here, and I'm going to go in again with a scalpel carefully and just remove some of the bumps of solder. It's actually quite useful to have a decent amount of solder around the nut so that it doesn't move, but the O-ring won't sit nice and flat, or whatever method you're using. So be careful doing this away from you. So if it flicks like that, you're not going to have a cut finger. I've done that plenty of times. And then get in with a file, a little needle file, something that will fit in amongst the steps and that kind of thing you've got there, just to clean it all up so that whatever you've got around there, the O-ring, etc., sits nice and flat, and the bogie itself sits flat. And then really it's just a case of checking the fit between the chassis and the body, making sure there's enough space for everything, making sure everything's straight and square and happy. We may well want to just take a little bit of the solder off the bottoms of those steps, that kind of thing. You can also do the insides of the roof, but it's probably not too much of a worry, because you can't really see that as well as other parts. So it's important to talk about primer. What is primer? So primer has two functions really. The first is to give a uniform base coat, which will really help future final coats to adhere, and also secondly, it protects the brass for sure, but it will show up any of those imperfections so that you can go in with a final kind of check just to make sure everything is as good as we possibly can make it. So it protects, it helps the additional coats, and it also shows up those issues. So let's talk about the interior. So I've made some 30 thou bits of plasticard. As it happened, I happened to have a strip which is exactly the right width between the edges there. You can see it fitting in. I just used the tin snips to cut this because it's pretty thin. Probably scissors would do as well, actually, because this is really decently thin. And we're just going to glue those between the sides. We need to leave room, of course, for the brackets which are inside the body to sit on top. I'm just going to show that. There's the brackets there, and they need to sit on top of the brass and the chassis without being affected by the interior piece of plasticard. So you've got to make sure you cut it the right length. Broadly, if you keep it the same length as those strengthening pieces of brass, you'll be about right. And we'll put the end seat on top of those end bits of those strengthening brackets. So how do we do this? We're going to hold it in place carefully, and then taking the ultra fine Sharpie, we're just going to poke through from the other side. There we go, 1, and then you've got to keep it in the same place, and 2 on the other side. And then when we flick it over, assuming the Sharpie's still got some ink, we will have 2 little holes there, which will be exactly in the right place for where you want to drill the 10 BA holes. A 2mm drill I use, and we'll get that here, and we'll do that and come back. So now I've done 2, and here they are, and you just use a scalpel and a file, etc., just to remove any mank in the holes and any burrs, etc., and then check them over by placing them back over the hole. Check that everything's in line, which it is. Happy days. And so then we can start to glue that in place. But before we do that, just a final check that there's no solder or those tabs that came through the tabs and slots in the way. Otherwise the plastic card won't sit straight. So just get in there with a file and just check that. These are all fine, but yeah, it's well worth doing that. Otherwise the interior won't sit straight. And we'll also make sure there's no oxidation or the chemical reaction from the flux underneath what we're about to glue. So make sure you get rid of all the mank off there, mank off the brass and there, and then I use my Rocket Rapid yellow glue. Don't want too much because you don't want it to seep out. You don't want it to go into the holes, the 10BA holes there. So a couple there and then 1 in the middle. And this glue gives you about 5 or 10 seconds, but because this is plastic card to brass, it will glue very quickly. So get it broadly over the holes, and you've got a little bit of time, but then there we are, we're in, and then press it down. And you probably want to hold that in place for a few seconds just to make sure. Don't press too hard, otherwise those steps will start to bow out underneath. Just enough to keep it in place while it glues. Some people put glue on both the plastic card and the brass. I've not found that necessary with this particular glue, but some people do that. Hold it for a few seconds, and there we go. That should all be good. And make sure you don't glue your fingers, of course, so I take them off from time to time just to check there isn't any glue on them. And there we have it. And that's all strong and sorted.
So we have been rather lucky that whilst making these coaches that this book has been published, and this is a work of absolute art. So it's available from the railway directly. They've got a website and it is astonishing. It is a record of all of the railway's history, but in particular drawings and photographs of all the rolling stock, a lot of the buildings and track plans and liveries and everything you could imagine. So we've been very, very lucky that during the modelling of these carriages, this book has come out, the Vale of Rydal Railway in detail. And this really is a compilation of some phenomenal photographs and particular drawings from the railway's archives. It is not cheap, but it is so worth it. And if we look at page 200 here, we can see some lovely drawings of the 1938 GWR Swindon built bogie closed thirds, which are the carriages we're modelling, and a nice drawing as well, which shows us some of the details, which is fantastic. We can also see some of the liveries, and obviously you can choose what you'd like to model your particular carriages if you're following me along with this build in. I'm going to go with the classic Great Western colours, which they broadly run in at the moment. You could go with blood and custard, you could go with this lovely green. Indeed, you could go with BR blue if you were a lover of that, or versions of that. And there are some fantastic drawings and information in here, including carriage repairs at Shrewsbury on the actual platform. Astonishing. Didn't know that happened. So yeah, wonderful book, highly recommended. And I'll just flick through and show you, details of the locos and the rebuilds, down to astonishing detail of the controls, and I mean, look at that photo there, it's just randomly come across. Absolutely fantastic and perfect for our needs. So from that I was able to make a little drawing. Nothing particularly wonderful about that. All I did was take the coach, pop it there, mark on the positions of the doors. They're different each side, as you can see, so door, 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 but door, door, door. And the slightly unusual approach, these are basically flaps, so these seats can actually come down to be full, but in this normal setup we just have the ends and two others which are full width. The other 1, 2, 3, 4 are kind of 2/3 of the way across. So that's how we will make our carriage interior. So the Dundas seats come, you actually get a pair like this, and some smaller pieces where you get 2 of these and obviously 2 of these. And if we take them apart, then we have exactly the right number of seats for this carriage, excepting that we're going to cut down 1, 2, 3, 4 of them because they're not the full width. These pieces go on top as the kind of backrests, and these are the end benches. So I'm now just going to clean those up, because obviously I've just pulled them off the fret, and then we will cut these back to approximate length, and we'll start to install them on their Plasticard Plastruct bases.
So another bit where we had some buzzing, so I'll have to do the audio on top. So this is about the seats, and I measured them to check the width, and then worked out what I thought the 2/3 width should be, and also check that against the coach that I'd already made. It doesn't have to be exact, but what you need to make sure is that each of the seats that are the 2/3 style are identical. So you can use one as the template for the others to cut them basically the same size, using tin snips, actually plastic snips in this occasion, and chop them across like that so that they're all the same, and a bit of a file just to clean up any mank on the ends. And the other point just to make are these backrests, which of course will be glued on right in the middle. Luckily there's a central plank which makes that easy, and we need to cut those back the same as well. So again, using it as a template.
Where we got to, so what I did was I used a Sharpie to mark the positions of the doors. Now obviously we knew the steps were broadly where the doors are, but I just wanted to be sure, so used a Sharpie on the Plasticard base here on both sides because the doors are in different places, and then glued in place the Plastruct. Plastruct was either 15, 18 or 5mm. The 5mm are the tiny little pieces to bridge the ends, and the slight complication was that you'll see here the hole here, I'm just using a paintbrush to try and show you, which goes through to the nut on the other side, which is the bogey pivot, needed a bit of cutaway of the Plasticard there. So every time I do that it changes focus, which isn't helpful. There, just to ensure that the nut that will poke through once it's screwed in from behind has got somewhere to go, and because these are hollow, of course, then there's somewhere for that nut to come up into. And then I glued in place the seats on top in the correct pattern as to the drawing that I've got there, and I'm about to do the other one. And then of course you can put the top on and just check that it all works with regard to each of the, I'll just pop it on now, that's obviously outside, it should be in, but you can see where the seats show, and check that against the drawing. Okay, so let's finally talk about the little details that we need to finally consider on this carriage. So there are some window bars across here. I would add them later before painting. The same is true of the grabs and the door handles and the other bits and pieces, door hinges, that kind of thing. I feel that spraying with primer first and then adding these details on top, particularly as they're brass, and therefore most of these details come as little brass things from the detailed shops, and you can keep them brass and then just glue them in, drill out the holes, glue them in, etc. After primer, same is true of vac pipes. You could even put the side chains depending on what era you're modelling. The rest of this we have already modelled, except for this you can see here and a little bit here. under the underframe. So what are they? So let's have a look at the drawing here. So these are vacuum tanks here. You can see the underside of them. There's actually a tank that goes up inside the chassis there, and there's a kind of actuator rod, and then there's a we'll probably use wire back to brake blocks on the bogies, and there's one here and there's one here. And what's actually interesting is this one, you can't tell on this 2D drawing, is closer to this side, and this one is closer to the other side. And I think there is an underside drawing, there it is, here we go, where you can see that the tank here, one is just slightly towards this side from centre, and the other's there. So we're going to look for some of these tanks. And the other thing that the drawing can tell us is that these vacuum cylinders are 12-inch diameter, i.e. in our scale they are 4mm. So let's see what we can find. So I found these bits. These are actually lamp tops, which are pretty much 4mm wide, so they'll work well. And then these are from Foremost models I happen to have in my spares box. And this part here, I'll cut off the other bit, but that part will work very well as the actuator. So I'm going to get some wire together as well. The crucial thing, and if we get back at one of the drawings, is that this piece of wire, which is going to come from the vacuum tank, which in this case is behind this step, doesn't interfere with the throw of the boat. So I measured from the drawing, and it's 43mm from the ends and 7mm in, and then I've literally just super glued the top hat ventilator, which is the right size for it to be a vacuum cylinder, and the actuating rod just with a bit of super glue.